Welcome to the Government and UFOs panel. We have a unique set of people here to talk about this with a lot of experience on this topic, so this ought to be really interesting. I'll go down the line just shortly. Now, they've all done lectures here, so you know a lot about them. Colonel Halt hasn't done his yet, but that will be very exciting, and that will be tomorrow. But we'll have him explain his experience in just a bit here. But first, in this first chair is Colonel Charles Halt. He had an incredible firsthand sighting. It was it happened over a couple days. There were many people who saw it. We'll have him talk about that more in a minute. John Alexander, who just spoke, who was a colonel in the Army, and he worked for Army Intelligence. He now does defense consulting. We have Ted Rowe, who has run NARCAP for many years, worked with pilots, and has to work with the government often on the cases he investigates. And of course, Stanton Friedman, who kind of introduced a lot of us when I was just a little kid. In diapers, he was looking at government documents. So that's when I was watching him. That's how I learned to talk, by watching Stanton Friedman. So like I promised to start off, and I think it's a good place to start, we will have Colonel Halt kind of describe in a nutshell his experience back in 1980.
1980.
Yep.
In December 1980, I was called upon to investigate something which I would just...
Get real close.
Am I close enough now?
No.
All right, can you hear me now?
Talk loud. Loudly.
All right, I'm going to holler. Is that better?
Yay.
In 1980, I was called upon to investigate an incident that was the best described as bizarre. 3 of our security policemen actually had a confrontation with a craft. I did not at the time believe. I thought there was a logical explanation. But the experience continued for 3 days. The third night I was out there and actually experienced something I'd like to describe for you tomorrow afternoon that's almost beyond belief. So come out to see me tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock and we'll talk a lot about it and I'll see what I can do to give you all the information I can.
My first question is actually for you, and an interesting part of this case is that you have said that you feel, because some of the witness said an organization came on base and debriefed some of the witnesses. You were deputy base commander, however, you were not made aware of this debriefing, and you believe this actually happened.
I was shocked when I found out, and I didn't find out till several years later. I was kept in the dark, to be very honest with you. A very, how shall I say, very close-held organization came in and used drugs and hypnosis on at least 5, 6, maybe more of my people, and definitely altered memories, did some strange things to them, and many of them have never been the same.
Mm-hmm. Now, given the talk that we just saw you do, John, it seems as though that would be a story that would be hard for you to accept. I mean, do you believe that happened, that these men were debriefed and drugged?
Well, Chuck and I have talked about it, and I've said, we happen to know some names, ought to bring charges against them if they did that. I also think that there's a difference between, big programs and I put in my talk that we have, 4 million people in the U.S. government, and if I extrapolate that, how many, you end up with about 480,000 people who have had sightings of some kind. So I am sure that there are organizations that go around, but this does not take a huge effort to be able to do that. It's interesting, by the way, with Bentwater, as I said, I think is one of the best cases that's there because it keeps getting better. The evidence that Chuck and others come out with that something physical did happen. One of the things you'll find with UFOs, Roswell, I don't care what the case is the data never all fit. And that's one of the most disconcerting things is you hear these pieces and trying to fit it all together and make sense of it, don't know. Wasn't there, so I can't speak to that. As he just mentioned, though, did not even find out about it until years later. Can these small things happen? Absolutely. Did they? I don't know. I've met many of the people that he's talking about and find them to be highly credible, and that some strange things definitely happened there.
Mm-hmm. Ted, in your experience investigating UFOs and working with pilots, is that shocking to you that something like that would happen?
Well, not necessarily. Our work is with the aviation system and the FAA, so a lot of the pilot cases we deal with aren't really security oriented. We set a standard in our investigations that if we thought we were moving into a black project, if we were looking at something that was probably a government project, that we would just stop our investigations. And in all the time I've been involved doing this, I've never been confronted by the government. I can't say they've been always cooperative or helpful, but I've never been confronted.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you had something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that. As you know, when I came to Vegas, I was working for Bob Bigelow, and we set up a meeting. I happen to have had a friend who was Deputy Director of Security for the FAA. Went down there to talk about being able to get cases from them. The thing that was surprising is that as we had a panel that was brought together there, most of them were quite accepting. There was nobody, I got a couple of eye rolls, what are you talking about? But people, even high-level air traffic controllers were saying, yeah, we get this stuff, we just don't talk about it.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Stanton, I would imagine that you're not surprised at all by what Colonel Halt has just described happening at Rendlesham.
No, I'm not. I've been interested in this subject for a long time, 1958. And it seems to me that there is ample indication of government lying, and people ask me, well, why? What's the point? Aren't we entitled to know? And stuff like that. And you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies is one of my mottos. Mm-hmm. And there are enemies out there. In case you didn't notice, the military budget this year is $1 trillion on planet Earth. So there's a lot of people angry at a lot of other people who are trying to keep in control. But as I mentioned in my talk about the Secretary of the Air Force lying, flat out lying. When you say 3% unknown and it's 21.5% unknown, that's a lie. I mean, it's not a rough, approximation.
And you're referring to the Blue Book results, where in the press they said it was 3% unknown, when in actuality, if you look at their files, it's more like
21.5% in that particular study. Mm-hmm. That's a big jump. I mean, that's not approximate, Mm-hmm. Furthermore, I can understand some of that on the basis of there's run-of-the-mill cases where people see things, you can't help witnesses being around when something happens, since these guys seem to be overflying the country all over the place, or the world. But relatively distant observations by general civilians and so forth is not a big deal, okay? We've grown accustomed to that. But what does matter, for example, is if you have recovered the wreckage of a flying saucer. Now you may have a chance to make a real breakthrough in developing military technology. The ability to fly the way these things do, up, down, back, forth, right angle turns, high speed, silent, etc. Every government would want to do that. That's my objection to the notion of Nazi UFOs. You mean Hitler was such a nice guy, he developed them, but he didn't want to use them? Mm-hmm. That makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
So the government, on the one hand, has to keep the peace, keep everybody happy. But as most people know, I'm an advocate of there being an MJ-12, Majestic 12. It makes sense because it fulfills the need of something I didn't talk about today. When we have General Carol Bolender, an Army general who was an engineer on the Lunar Excursion Module program, which there was a lot resting on our being successful in going to the moon in terms of the world political situation. When he gets asked, what should we do about Project Blue Book, and the University of Colorado, Condon had said, let's close it, it's not contributing anything. So he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, saying reports which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. And he said, paragraph later, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have a place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, the question is, what the hell happened to those reports? I checked with Office of Naval Intelligence. We don't have anything about UFOs, they told me. That's the oldest of the big intelligence agency. And it's a big ocean out there, and I can't believe that they don't have anything or stuff didn't go through them. So what I'm saying is the answer to what Bolander said, what does he mean when he says we'll continue to investigate when the Air Force says we're finished? Mm-hmm. And I'm saying the reports, I think, went to this other group, Majestic 12. And not only is there wreckage of saucers to worry about, but flight behavior as observed by instruments, gun cameras, electromagnetic detectors, and so forth on board military aircraft. We try to find out everything we can about Russian airplanes and Chinese airplanes, right? I mean, it's part of your military job, gentlemen.
Technology desk.
What?
Yes, close to the mic stand.
Close, okay. Oh. That's loud. So what I'm saying is that I don't think most of the people in the government know what's going on. You don't keep secrets by telling everybody and hoping they'll keep their mouths shut. The need to know concept is basic here. Mm-hmm. And how many people would have a need to know for this kind of technical data? Yep. I mean, let me give you a silly example. There's a picture in one of my books of me with my hand on the command module for Apollo 12. I was at the facility where it was built in California. And they took me around. I gave a lecture, and they took my picture with this. When you look at that thing, I grew up thinking that a high-speed aircraft had to have a pointy nose, sharp wings, highly streamlined, right? You know, the X-15 kind of thing. Here's this round, blunt body that looks a heck of a lot more like a flying saucer than an X-15. And then I found out they were doing wind tunnel tests back in the late 40s on round vehicles. So I can see no reason for anybody who was doing that to say anything publicly, or anybody could pin it down to have anything at all to do with UFOs. Mm-hmm. But it makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. So you've talked about certain agencies, and John, we'll get to a response. I can see you want to respond. But before we get to debating the amount of secrecy, or even that it exists, the FAA, there's plenty of examples, like Stanton have said, that there is secrecy. The FAA recently told John Greenwald that they had no UFO records. But we know, at least in the Chicago O'Hare case, for instance, in 2008, they admitted to the Chicago Tribune that they did get UFO reports that would constitute UFO records. You've worked a lot with the FAA. What have you found? Do you believe there is secrecy there? Have they had this double-speak issue with you?
Well, they have, but if you look at the Airman Instruction Manual, the AIM Manual, the instructions are that if you're a pilot and you want to report a UFO, you're invited to take it to a civilian UFO research group. They don't want to hear from that pilot to begin with. So the information is being blocked right there because pilots really won't respond to that. That's part of the reason why we set up NARCAP. We modeled it after the FAA's Aviation Safety Reporting System, which is a confidential reporting system. And they quite certainly do get UAP reports, and they flag them and forward them to us. So, you're dealing with an institutional mindset that has shifted over the years. I mean, the managers today were watching Star Trek when they were kids. which is a whole different bunch than the guys from the 50s that were then managing in the 70s and 80s. The JANAP 146 and the Service regimen had a very chilling effect on pilots talking about these things. And at the same time, we did aircrew surveys. United didn't want anything to do with us, but other carriers did. And so, again, it's a kind of an institutional thing. They feel like they shouldn't talk about it, but they don't really know whether they should or not. Inside the FAA itself, it's a little bit of a different story. But again, we're dealing with career bureaucrats who are looking out for themselves and don't want to have a woo-woo discussion, never mind a national security incident. Mm-hmm. So when we had the case like O'Hare, United tried to put the kibosh on anybody talking out of United, but we heard about it from United ramp controller. And the ground crew saw it. There were a lot of observations that certainly validated that there was an oblate spheroid hovering over the C-17 terminal there, and that it burned a hole in the clouds when it left. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of this, well, I'm going to stop right there because I think there's more to be said, but I'm going to let these guys carry the ball.
I did want to clarify, UAP is a term that Ted used, and that's a term they use, and means unidentified aerial phenomena.
Yes.
And it's a term that Hillary Clinton actually used on Jimmy Kimmel recently because John Podesta, her campaign manager, talked with you.
That's right. We pushed that term in 2000. We did a market analysis of ufology, basically, because we're building a research organization and we're trying to figure out how not to step in it and move our materials forward. And we saw a lot of problems that would damage our credibility. And one of them was simply the terminology itself. UFO is not accurate. Often these things are lights that might mask a form, but you don't know that. You can't say it's an object because it's a glowing ball of light. So we chose this term, unidentified aerial phenomena. Dr. Haynes defined it in 1980. Yeah, he did that. He was working with Joe Hynek at the time when he did that. And so he came up with this great definition of unidentified aerial phenomena, and we call it UAP/object or /light. And then we immediately carried the promotion into all of our conversations about it, and ufology understood it and took that on, and now it's common vernacular. But I was invited back to Washington, D.C. in 2003, I believe it was. Was it 2003, John? I think you went to a couple of those. Podesta called a number of us back. Dr. Bali, Dr. Haynes, myself, Dr. Heisch, we brought a bunch of materials back there because there had been an overflight and a pursuit across Washington, D.C. of a UAP, and the attention had come to Representative Tom Davis, who was the head of the Committee on Government Reform at the time. And so he asked Podesta to kind of muster a crew, and then we did. We came. Dr. Kaku vetted our materials, and then we briefed some congressmen. Mm-hmm. And then we eventually participated in a congressional hearing.
Now, John, before you respond to the secrecy issue, to clarify that FAA isn't the only organization that says they don't have files when we know that they do. For instance, you talked about JNAP 146 and the Bollinger memo where he said, we already investigate UFOs and will continue to do so. The Air Force says today they do not. However, if you go look at JNAP 146 and its predecessor, and you could speak to this, there's an OPREP 3 reporting system where it's a very high-level intelligence report. Ted is shaking his head. In the movie yesterday, UFOs and Nukes, Robert Hastings has a lot of those files. And these were very important incidents that happened. Some of these were flyovers of bases that had nuclear weapons, like in Rendlesham. And these warranted an OPREP 3 report that said UFO sighting. And these were sent to NORAD. NORAD denies having any UFO files. The NSA and the DIA said they had UFO files, and Stanton showed those earlier and how they were blacked out or whited out. But those were not redacted. There were some that were redacted somewhat, but recently when John Greenwald asked for those to be fully redacted, they said, oops, we lost them. First the NSA said that, then the DIA said that. They lost their unredacted UFO files. These lies and these losses of files, allegedly, what are we supposed to think? Go for it.
Yeah, let me have a shot at that one. You know, well, now we have electronic files, so it's easier, but in the past, if everybody kept their files, Washington would literally sink into the swamp that it was built on. What I tell folks is that when I left, well, you know, annually, we had a requirement to report the linear feet of documents destroyed. Not what documents were destroyed, but literally based on SAFE, how many feet of documents were destroyed. So the other thing I want to mention is on FOIA. From most government agencies, FOIA is not a front burner thing. The people who are involved in, you know, you don't have the brightest bulbs that are in there illuminating the field, or the ones that are going to have to go through the files and try to make sense of it. And it is, in general, a very, very low priority. The people you're going to assign there are not your best skilled people. So the potential for getting this screwed up is really high.
So just a bunch of clerical screw-ups.
Well, no, it can, you do. When I was keeping, I did have for a while a bunch of secret, top secret documents. Most of them are now in the public domain. The only reason they existed was because of an old boy net of people in various agencies who knew I was interested, I knew they were, and we would pass these up because there would routinely have been destroyed. Not for something nefarious, but just got to make this stuff go away.
Well, I guess, and just a follow-up before we get to Charles, your response, then what about the lies? Why are they saying they haven't investigated UFOs since 1969 when we have government documents? DIA has government documents on their website of UFO investigations that the Air Force began. We don't know where those finished, but you know, FAA, all of these organizations, why lie? Yeah, that's to you.
Well, I'm not sure. You're assuming that they're overtly lying, which is one of the possibilities.
Well,
this
it's an
is-
alternative fact then, which I know you're not fond of.
Understand, the topic is a pain in the ass, okay? One of the reasons that the Condon report was accepted the way it is the Air Force just wanted to make it go away. It's a zero-sum game in resources. I use very few people understand government resourcing and how budgets get aligned and whatnot. But basically what you do is you have one-to-end priority list of here are the things we must do, here are the things we'd like to do, here are the things we do if we can, and you know, competing in that just doesn't make sense. So an action passed is an action handled. So if I can just make it go away, that's the easiest thing to do.
You want
2 points that this kind of fits in with what you asked. Over the past several years, the British government has released all of their UFO files. Well, Nick Pope and I went back and looked for the files for the time frame of December 1980 when I was involved in the event. There was nothing there to speak of. And so he went back further and asked, and they said, oh, they've gone missing. Can you believe it? They're gone. I leave that one with you. An even better story, in 1990, I was running the inspection director for the DODIG. I had total inspection oversight of the whole department, all services, all agencies. We looked at everything from child care to where the president goes if there's a nuclear disaster. We did an organizational inspection of the NSA. At that same time, Larry Warren, who I consider a pretender to the 1980 incident I was involved in, was making a lot of noise. He was trying to get his military records because he wanted to go back on active duty. And he had a couple of congressmen working with him. He had the former Secretary of Defense working with him. Nobody could pry the records loose. But what he did get told was that the NSA had them. He called me a week before we were doing the NSA inspection and said, I'm going to the Washington Post. I'm going to blow this up. Oh, well, good for you. But anyhow, I told my team chief, who was going out after we'd done the in-brief, I said, Bill Shea did the inspection for me, or his team. I said, you tell your counterpart out there that Larry Warren is going to the press, and he's going to make some noise, so they better be prepared for whatever they're going to have to handle. In other words, take appropriate action. He went on around 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning. At 10 o'clock, I got a call from the chief of the compromise branch at NSA. Introduced himself. We talked a few minutes. He said, "Tell me about this, Mr. Warren." So I told him a little bit of the story, and he said, "We don't know anything about that." We talked for a while, and I realized he knew more than I knew about it, and this was 10 years later, so they obviously had a file.
Now, were you ever told, and Ted spoke to this, he was never told to shut up about it. Were you ever told not to talk about the Rendlesham incident?
Never at the time. The first time anybody talked to me that I thought was officially debriefing was 8 or 10 years later, was John Alexander, who had a personal interest, or so he said, in the case. He called me when he was still on active duty, and I was too, and he said, "I'd like to talk to you about Bentwaters." I said, "Great, somebody's finally going to debrief me." So we got together and we talked for a while, and I realized at that time I was a bit suspicious, but he was pretty much interested in it from a personal standpoint. No, I've never been officially debriefed. I've never been officially told not to talk about it. Because I have come forward, because I've been thrust into the light, I've lost a lot of my military friends who say, you know, you never should have said that, you never should have talked. Well, all my superiors went and hid. They sawed the branch off and left me out there.
But you do believe there are secrets. There is secrecy.
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind.
And there's an overall agency. Is there an overall agency you believe?
Well, I have some personal thoughts on that. For a long time, I thought the CIA or the NSA was running the show. I don't today. I think that all the three-letter agencies, FBI, CIA, DIA, on and on and on, are agents, and how shall I say, they act on orders, they collect things, and it's going somewhere that's outside the government. My personal opinion.
MJ-12 is not 3 letters.
Go ahead.
Stan's brought up MJ-12 several times. I would like to say I believe that MJ-12 was real. I think the list of the people was real, and I also think it had absolutely nothing to do with UFOs. There was another really strategic issue that was being developed at the time, and the list of people on there make absolutely perfect sense for that.
I think it would take
We'll have to talk about that, John.
Yeah. And you have,
Couple
and,
little bit here.
and of course even Stanton and I have talked, because I actually not sure there is that organization. However, Chuck, you talked about probably some private organization or private group. Ted, what are your thoughts on an overall kind of overseeing organization when it comes to UFOs?
I agree with Colonel Halt here that it's outside of the government. We're served by corporations and dominated by corporations, and a lot of those corporations are building our observation platforms, our sensing devices, they're manning them, they're gathering the data and collecting it and interpreting for the government. And it makes good sense to me that within a number of years, most things UFO could be migrated right out of government control and be lost to even government officers and even knowing they existed.
And Stan, so when you talk about MJ-12, because of course those alleged documents came out quite some time ago, talking about an organization that was even older. I mean, do you believe, what do you believe is going on with whatever oversight organization there may be today?
Well, I think what's going on is that people have very carefully intended to get only information that would be useful in their primary goals, not to deal with, quote, the big UFO picture, but to deal with data that would be useful in designing new systems, in dealing with something if the Russians figure out how they work before we do, how to counteract that, and not bother with run-of-the-mill. How many tens of thousands of UFO reports do we have out there? Who cares for most of them? They don't mean anything. You know, as a nuclear guy, you get used to having situations where a tiny percentage of what you're dealing with is useful and most of it isn't. Uranium-235 is 0.7% of uranium atoms. Would you say, well, it's useless, less than 1%? The real answer is that's the stuff you want. It's the other stuff that doesn't matter. the U-238, which is 99.3%. So I think if you're going to set up a sensible intelligence-based organization, that you're looking to deal with the good stuff, and the hell with the junk. Let somebody else worry about that.
John, did you want to respond?
I want to respond to something that Ted raised here, and that's about the civilian industry. And the problem that I see there is what I call the bagats. And if you follow the history of these agencies, or the civilian companies, there are components that have broken up. You talk to somebody, say, I work for Raytheon, but I used to work for this one who worked for that one, and their life changed. So over time, and particularly as there's been huge acquisitions and mergers, one of the things you have to do is reveal everything that you're doing. So I think that it would have shown up there. Second issue that I want to throw out that I think alludes to Stan. The classification system that we have in the U.S. today is awful. They just, I'll give an example. I read the promulgating documents on the global war on terror. It was at a meeting at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I read it, and it was classified, and they said, what is classified about this? They say, if this is classified, the New York Times must be top secret. There's nothing here above common sense. The answer, unfortunately, was it's easier to classify everything than to figure out what we really need to protect. And it's an awful approach.
Wow. It is an awful approach.
Well, and to follow up with that, how many of you have gotten a classification because of work that you've done in conjunction with a private company or a public company?
I had a Q clearance for 14 years in industry.
Mm-hmm. John, I would assume? And you would never talk about anything that you did back then to jeopardize that clearance, I would imagine.
I hope not. People say, well, those guys in MJ-12 would have told their wives what they were doing, and I'd say, poppycock. You never tell your wife anything classified, do you, John?
Well, no.
Careful, fellas.
There is another program or another problem that's associated with it. You get read into things and briefed on specific projects, but when you leave, even after you're debriefed, nothing ever follows, because I've read articles in the newspapers like, what? We're talking about this in fact, there was one in this recent release by the CIA on a project that was in there that I thought was still TS and whatnot. And here it is suddenly just being released. So people are you may be debriefed at that moment, but that does not follow you. So like when you retire or whatever, you never find out what happened to the project or if when it finally gets into the public domain.
But the point being that the last person, someone whose career is based off of, they work in defense, they need to have those clearances. They're not going to get those if they ever jeopardize those clearances or say something. And so the last thing they're going to do is talk about something they've worked on in the past. And I think everybody would agree with that, which is a good way to keep secrets. It means those secrets can be kept. Yes, Ted.
We're talking about the government side of this. It's also important to understand that, for example, the CIA boasted that it could make or break any story in the media within 24 hours, back when it was all pen and pencil landlines. And why would they do that for anything, much less for UFOs? And the answer is PSYOPs. They're controlling the way people think about things. They're controlling information to keep public opinion moving in directions that will keep funding going or manage other aspects. And it seems to me that this subject is kind of the same situation. If you want to look at it through the lens of exogenous incursions, we're occupied. Given the density of these observations, if all of these things are examples of alien tech, then we are occupied. We have, and any one of these things is more than a match for everything we've got, never mind 100 of them, as are sometimes seen in formation flying around. And yet the conversation doesn't percolate into the news media very far, and it holds with the ridicule factor, right in line with the Robertson panel to begin with, which was probably the first real drive for a PSYOP to control the way people think on this.
Better tell them what a PSYOP is.
Well, psychological operations to control the way people think and the way they behave, and to use it by feeding them information that isn't necessarily true. And in this situation where we're looking at this up to this point, what would be the motivation for doing that, given what these fellows have said, that it really is just about keeping basic secrets to deal with current defense problems that are terrestrial? And my guess on that would be that like the Brookings Institution reminded us, that being subsumed by a technically superior culture is pretty much the end of our society. And if you want to keep things going on Earth while this occupation is going on, and you can't figure out how many of them you have to knock down or kill before they stop coming here, then you want your society to continue unaffected. And the way you do that is keep the information from them so that Joe Average can get on the bus and go to work every day and raise his family, and Earth can be what it is. And the power structures involved can continue managing the planet the way they care to do it without competition.
There's not only technology here, there's power.
That's right.
We have a planet with 200 countries, maybe 200 plus or minus a few, right?
Depends on the week.
Yeah. And so people who run those countries are people in power. None of us identifies himself as, I'm an earthling.
That's right.
Let's do what's best for the planet. You ever hear anybody talk like that in
they
government?
don't. Nope.
I don't think so. So there are other kinds of threats. If the world was pushing toward a planetary view of things, there'd be an awful lot of people who'd be out of power. An awful lot of people who wouldn't be making the money they're making, too, the corporate structure, if you will. So there are other things here. There's religion to worry about.
That's right.
I've heard somebody say, did Jesus die to save us all? That's a provocative question when you stop to think about that. The Pope has some status in the world. Yeah. He said he's willing to baptize an alien if they ask. Which is
Even
one of
one
those
with
things. What did he
multiple
say?
Send the Jesuits to.
Yeah, the Jesuits.
Charles, did you have a? Oh, okay. John. Oh, you didn't? Okay. Then let's move to the next question. And in fact, when we get past this set of questioning, which will probably take about 5-10 minutes, we will then open the mic for the Q&A. So if you have a question, you can start to come up to the microphone here. But this is going to be a set of questions of recent developments, I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know, John, you talked about this a bit in your talk, and I believe the others are at least somewhat aware of this, and we'll go down the line. We'll start with you and your thoughts, Charles. But in the Podesta emails we mentioned earlier, a big part of the election, of course, were the WikiLeaks, his emails being leaked. And in there was actually some pretty interesting information in that. Podesta had a meeting with an executive vice president from Lockheed Skunk Works, the organization who built and ran Area 51, developed a lot of top secret aircraft and continue to do so. A general who is in charge of the labs at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, whom Tom DeLonge made the point to Podesta is a guy who he says, is where the Roswell material went. And then also a man who is a general retired, who was an assistant to the commander of Space Command. And we do have an Air Force Space Command, believe it or not. And so this meeting happened, and this meeting was, the reason it happened was that Tom DeLonge, who is a rock star, wanted to get these people together because he says government insiders have told him we've back-engineered alien technology and they would like this information to get out. We know that he's close with the general who is the assistant of Air Force Space Command, and according to DeLonge, they're giving him information to get out to the public to release this fact. Pretty shocking that this meeting happened. Have you heard about this, Charles? Do you believe a meeting like that, do you believe a disclosure effort like that could be happening within the government?
Let me tell you something. That isn't the only meeting. Leslie Keene, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with Leslie Keene. She was here a couple years ago and wrote a best-selling book, UFOs, Generals, and Pilots, I believe it was entitled. Leslie Keene set up a special meeting in Washington 2 years ago, and I was invited along with a lot of other people who have had similar experiences, and we met with John Podesta and had a long conversation and gave him a good briefing, and he had a dying interest in the subject and was doing all he could to get it released. And we did everything we could to cooperate with him. But I will say, I don't think he's going to succeed. If you remember back when Bill Clinton was elected, Warren Hubble, who was his chief of staff, and he told Warren Hubble supposedly when he got elected, the first two things I want to know, who killed Kennedy and are UFOs real? He never got an answer. It's known that, excuse me.
Oh, Webster Hubble.
Can you hear me all
This
right?
obnoxious young man over here is, no, just kidding.
Jimmy Carter had a dying interest in UFOs. He asked George Bush when he was a CIA director, and he was told, you don't have a need to know. So, good luck, I guess is the answer.
John, we'll go down the row
Okay,
if that's
this one.
okay. John, did you want to respond? I mean, you mentioned Tom
No,
DeLonge, and you
hey.
said this is something to look at.
Yeah, the meeting happened, I don't think there's any doubt about that. I can tell you about another meeting that took place with Bob Bigelow and myself at Space Command, and we started talking about man in space and change it, and their eyes glazed over. I mean, this was not on their agenda, understanding what's going on. For them, the ISS was the ultimate of space technology and where we're going to be. A little surprised, I will mention that you mentioned Lockheed Skunk Works. Ben Rich was a friend of mine. Ben was the second president when I was running that group. He was one of the people that was brought in. He was certainly interested, but he had a shopping list. And he says, I want propulsion, I want stealth, I want, that. And no indication that Skunk Works had anything like that, but would like to.
Ted,
Well, as Colonel Holt mentioned before, that Jimmy Carter had an interest in this, and he tasked Daniel Sheehan to do the research on it and go out and find the information and compile a report, which Daniel did. And I've spoken with Daniel about this a couple of times, and he said that he had photographs of crashed vehicles and officers and their name tags and the whole 9 yards. But it went before Bush Sr., who was head of the CIA for that year or so at the time, and he nixed the report and it was never released. So it's all provocative, but it's all word of mouth. And I think there's this constant shutting it down. People start to want to talk, they start moving in a direction, and then there's either, as these guys said, there's not really any interest in carrying the ball, or they're threatened by even having the conversation. So.
and Stan, did you want to comment?
Well, I'm concerned here because we need to allow room for a very small group of people running very important projects. That's the history of government in a way, and many different projects. And where there is willingness to lie. I happened to see at that time, ex-President Carter at a Boston airport. And I could see a Secret Service man with him and stuff. I walked over very carefully, waiting for airplanes, and thanked him for some of the things that he'd done. And then we talked about the fact that one of the reasons the person he put in as head of the CIA was they were old classmates from the Naval Academy, and that presidents were often not told the whole truth by their CIA directors. This is coming from a former president of the United States.
Can you imagine?
And that is an eye-opener, and I think we need to allow, I don't want to talk conspiracy things here, but there have been conspiracies to keep things secret.
All kinds of things.
It's part and parcel of the whole picture here.
Stan, let me add a little something there. When we did the NSA inspection, what we found out is the director had next to no knowledge of what was going on in the organization. He administratively knew what was happening, but every time we opened the door, we found 3 more doors, and we never got any further. And of course, our role was an administrative inspection. We were not allowed into the beyond top secret areas, but we were shocked to find out how little the director actually knew.
There's also a long history of the CIA refusing to share information. Let's just look back at the torture tapes. They were supposed to deliver 95 tapes of enhanced interrogations to the Senate committee, the Oversight Committee, and instead they destroyed them. And they did it blatantly. They were told to deliver it, and they chose to destroy it. There's an adversarial relationship in the intelligence community, oftentimes, with the political leadership.
All right, let's open up to the questions. So here's the microphone. Be sure to get very close to the microphone when you ask your question.
Well, thank you very much. This is truly a dream panel. I want to ask about a particular case, and I specifically want to ask John Alexander and Stanton Friedman. First of all, let me say that if I could only recommend one book for UFO beginners, it would be John Alexander's book. Seriously, and the others are great too, but that should be like must reading. But you do mention the Cash Landrum case in your book. And this is a baffling case. It's a case that undeniably has physical reality because 2 people were injured, went to the hospital, as a matter of fact, sued the government because, this was just outside of Austin, Texas. There were helicopters seen, multiple witnesses were involved. Obviously, unless it was just the weirdest UFO thing ever, there were government craft involved in this. And yet, nobody's leaked about it. As far as I know, the information has never come out. It is still an unsolved mystery. And let me go on to say, this happened, I believe, about 1980.
It happened the same time we were having our experience
Yes,
at Bentwaters.
exactly the same time as Bentwaters. It seems to me maybe there was still research going on involving nuclear propulsion in spite of the fact an agreement had been signed. But my suspicion is that it had nothing to do with aliens or UFOs. It had more to do with government secrecy. How come you were not able to penetrate any of that, or it didn't come out?
Yeah, I would disagree. I did write to Cash Landrum, actually got tangentially involved because
maybe we could
the case came to the Army.
Describe
I
the
had
event.
been an inspector general, and a friend of mine, George Saran, is the guy who actually got the case. The reason we got the case is the Air Force was being sued, and they said there were CH-47s, said, oh, that's an Army helicopter that was identified. There's supposed to be 22, 23 of them, the count varies, circling.
Let me, for people who don't know the case, because it's a great case and really interesting, describe that real quick. And then you can correct anything if I get any of the facts wrong. But essentially, this was a kind of a top-shaped craft that this family had come upon on a rural road in Texas. They got out of the craft, but it was emitting a heat that was even melting their dashboard. So they got back into their car. They left. They had seen a bunch of military helicopters around, seeming to accompany this craft. And over time, they all got sick. Some of them passed away, possibly from their injuries. And John Schuessler, one of the guys who founded MUFON, actually helped them sue the government because they felt that the government was involved. If the craft wasn't there, at least the helicopters were theirs. And it sounds like that's when it came to you. And you're saying no.
Well, hair fell out. Had a lot of...
The incident absolutely happened. Alopecia started. What's interesting is Betty Cash and Landrum, as they described the case, the little boy was in the back, Coley had jumped in. What was interesting, not if you're a participant, but the description of what happened from radiation illness is entirely consistent with the story. Cash, who was driving, got out and got in front. She got whole body radiation. Cody, the little boy, saw a little bit, jumped in the back, not as much. The other one was standing behind the door and was not irradiated nearly as much. It fits with radiation illness of some kind. One of the hypotheses, of course, was that we were testing Sam was talking about
Nuclear-powered something.
a nuclear drive thing that got away from them. The problem with that is that, we looked for the helicopters and didn't find them. We had one helicopter pilot come forward and said I was flying. Right. George put him under oath. He said, whoa, wait a minute. There was drinks at a bar. It really sold well. The case is terribly perplexing because A, it happened, B, the helicopters we can't account for. At the time, Task Force 160 was not known. That's the black helicopter unit that was out of Fort Campbell at the time. The other problem, as Chuck noted, this is between Christmas and New Year's.
That's right.
Excuse me, if you know anything about the military, excuse me, not much happens between Christmas and New Year's. If you're going to test things like this, you don't test them in a civilian domain. We got an area close to where I live where you go test strange weapons. I've got my hypothesis on this is really strange.
That is really
But it
strange.
gets more back to can you project images like that as a self-protection device, or put the information into the individual. By the way, it wasn't just the three people that saw it. There were other
That's right.
witnesses.
There was a
that
sheriff
saw the
deputy
case
that
as
also
well.
saw it, and another witness. And the other thing about it, not to take up more time, but this thing was bobbing up and down, which acted very much like some of the nuclear propulsion systems that were being experimented with in the 60s before the nuclear test ban treaty, which is why I wanted Stanton Friedman to also comment.
But before Stanton, to finish your thought, you feel, though, that it was not a human-made craft, that it was a non-human...
That would be my take, yes.
Mm-hmm. Stanton.
Well, as far as I know, the AMP program was canceled 1961. And it was for long-range flights, where you could run an engine for 1,000 hours. That would be kind of neat if you didn't have to refuel.
Exactly.
And bombers, that sort of thing. Big
Space
stuff.
flight, too.
Yeah. So I can't imagine that was one of ours. I can imagine that if it was a UFO, flying saucer, whatever you want to call it, UAV, UAP, in trouble, that the government would want to make sure that it didn't escape, so to speak, and that they were there when it came down. Wouldn't that make sense? From an intelligence viewpoint? You don't want Joe Blow from Idaho down there and look what I found kind of thing. So I can see the government having a strong vested interest. If it was ours, because somebody would sue them, and if it was theirs, them out there, we don't want anybody else to get a hold of it. So there are motivations here that are understandable. You don't want to do something stupid, right, John?
Well, let's assume that some people from Idaho are good people.
Yes.
Let's move on to the next question. Oh, it's that obnoxious young man from before. James Fox, everybody.
Hello, James. Hi. Hello. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
So, first of all, I want to say what a wonderful panel. I have deep respect for each and every one of you. But I was in the back during some of your discussions, and I was like, I got to raise my hand. I desperately need to ask this question, so I got in line as quickly as I could. It is widely known that Dr. Jalen Hynek had an entirely different position during his early years at Project Blue Book. He later on did a 180 and changed his position entirely on the subject matter. And I'm just proposing this question to you.
So he
Colonel
thought it was
Alexander.
silly at first. He even said it's kind of ridiculous.
He would put forth what he would call prosaic explanations when clearly there was not a
Like
prosaic
swamp
explanation. So what my question is directed at Colonel Alexander. Even though I have tremendous respect for what you say, I differ in my position in terms of Is there, or could there be a point in your research where you might take a different position on the so-called cover-up aspects of the government's involvement?
Well, one of the things I said in the talk is, first of all, when you get into this field, all the pieces never fit together. I do think there are folks who are interested, who do, research. Chuck mentioned, the things that happen to them. Is that a large concerted effort? I've got problems with that. I mean, there's a saying that if two people in Washington know, it's not a secret. I addressed the issue of, and I guess this is where Stan and I are going to probably disagree a bit, but one thing is other cover-ups and things, yeah, but they've all been discovered. I mean, that's one of the things that we do know about.
How do you know they've all
Is it
been
possible?
discovered?
Yeah. You wouldn't know.
You don't know about the ones that haven't been discovered.
Yeah, go ahead.
To take this just a hair further, I lost my train of thought here. Let's go ahead and take the next question. I knew what I was going to say, but I don't think it's going to help.
Okay, hi. MJ-12 was ostensibly established to take care of this, or to deal with this UFO phenomenon. Colonel Alexander doesn't believe it's for that purpose, even though it probably existed. But wouldn't it make sense that some organization, if it's not MJ-12 related, continues in the black budget world, because Colonel Alexander said that money is a zero-sum game in the government, and I don't believe it. I think it's a specious argument because you have column A versus column B, but there's actually a column C. There's all those $25+ billion in a black budget, which can balance those easily in column A or column B if you're taking money away. So wouldn't it make sense that some organization has put regulations in place to deny access to information or put restrictions on pilots or to not debrief people correctly in one of these triple letter organizations or the military industrial complex, which protects their own vital interests from any kind of technology that has been discovered? I mean, that would, to me, seem the place to be, rather than the quote-unquote constitutional government that we're supposed to be voting for. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
John?
Is that mine or?
Anybody?
Yeah,
Okay.
all four, because it all deals with.
Yeah, well, no, I think you need to look at the budget process and the funding and how things work. I do think there are, again, I've talked about the number of people who have had experiences. I gave the example in my talk today about a very, very high-level folk or individual who was abducted, and gives a story that is really, terribly hard to explain, in a position to ask questions and that, and did. They don't come up with, again, a program where you have the continuity. What you're describing is something that would have to have continuity for decades.
Years, decades, correct.
The Corso story is a classic example of that. He did work with General Trudeau, and if you follow that story, there was the Foreign Intelligence Division, which was created about that time, disappeared. We knew the Chief of Staff. Chief of Staff goes down the line. He becomes the three-star general who runs DESRATA, the research and development for the Army. So he said, okay, yeah, I knew about these talks. You would expect, if your hypothesis is right, that the organization would have come under his domain later. And they don't. I really think it's much more pockets of information of people who are interested and kind of talk to each other. And again, you look at it from a military perspective in particular, we change jobs continuously. Mm-hmm. So you start looking at continuity. That's one of the reasons they say you want civilians in certain jobs is to maintain continuity. But when you say the general's this and the general's that, these guys rotate with even more frequency than the lower ranks.
But when it comes to budgets, I think to his point, I don't think you would want to defend, especially in the latest few years, that the Defense Department is very good at accounting.
Accounting.
I mean, you would have to admit that they've had some pretty major issues in the last few years when it comes to accounting.
Wouldn't some organization be in existence a la MJ12, but maybe not from their aegis to
I think it's much
manipulate
more-
this
yeah,
information
I think it's much
transfer?
more likely to behave like the study that I put together, where actually you weren't funded to participate. You had to have all of the right clearances. You had to have interest. We had to know who you were, to put it in. There was no institutional. I think those things occur more frequently than you might imagine. But
Charles.
there are budgetary limits. You have to understand how the budget works. There are certain target thresholds that under a certain amount, by the way, right now, as I understand, around 20 million, you can muck about down there and get away with lots. If you get above that, then you start getting, you got to find out where the money comes, getting reprogramming permission and things like that. It's terribly complex, and it is a zero-sum game.
Charles, I think.
Several years ago, I was approached by Senator Byrd. You probably remember who Senator Byrd was. He was probably the second most powerful person in the country, by a senior staffer who was digging, trying to get information on UFOs. And his tack was to follow the money. And that's what he was doing. And he came to me, and I gave him all the information I could. Of course, I knew nothing about the money. But he was digging, he was going here, and he was going there, and I touched base with him much later, and he said they were totally unsuccessful. The money, wherever it was coming from or wherever it was going, was so well disguised that he couldn't find it.
All right.
Secrets can be kept, you mean?
Yeah, Ted, did you want to respond?
Going along with Stan's comment just now, it's been said that secrets can't be kept, and if there's two people that know them. But let's go back for a minute and take a look. The mid-'70s and the church hearings. Dr. Olson was murdered by the CIA. His family was able to track it down and pretty well de facto prove it. The government was embarrassed. They gave the family some money, and they went ahead with the church hearings, which was an analysis of the CIA and its behavior. Kind of a dog and pony show, but they did dig a bit. And what happened in the process was the CIA sacrificed certain programs to be made known, like MK Ultra, but through Operation Artichoke and our good friend Mr. Cheney, there were other projects. The whole purpose of that project was to obfuscate the other programs that might involve terminal interrogations or other things we can only guess at. So sometimes, there's layers upon layers. The CIA's corporation, it has its own agenda, and a lot of these agencies do. So it's a shell game. It's hard to see. If you want to go there to get information, you're going to work really hard for it. That's why I prefer to go out in the desert and watch the darn things and take pictures of them, man.
Well,
Go ahead.
the church hearings surprised an awful lot of Americans. This is in the early 70s. It was determined that hundreds of journalists, sometimes with their management knowing what they were doing, were in bed with the CIA and kept them informed of this, that, and the other thing. In some cases, the management didn't know what they were doing. And in a sort of relevant example here, Aviation Week in Space Technology, the real editors found that one of their people was reporting, working with the CIA, and he was fired. And the reason this is relevant is only that Phil Glass worked for them, and he would damn well not have made known his connection with anybody like the CIA. That is a three-letter agency, I'm sorry, but still. What I'm saying is there was a great shock in a lot of places that all these, some of them well-known, some of them not well-known, journalists were reporting to the CIA. Now, if you want to find out what's going on with the Russians, you talk to somebody who has the right to be at a meeting with Russians and then reports back what they said. I saw reports. I was doing a project on, great title, Analysis and Evaluation of Fast and Intermediate Reactors for Space Vehicle Applications. This was done, but one word was left out, Soviet. I was evaluating for the Air Force what the Russian capabilities were with regard to putting nuclear reactors in space. And so I'd go back to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, go to Battelle Memorial Institute, which had all the classified stuff, all Russian technology stuff. And what I found was, occasionally you'd come across a report from somebody who had been at a meeting and made a report to the CIA about what he heard there, a source for the CIA. He didn't work for the CIA in the general sense of the word. He was being a dutiful citizen. They knew he was at this meeting, and he got debriefed. What did you hear? What did the Russians ask about? What did any of our people say that they shouldn't have said? There was an internal intelligence movement, if you will. Now, that shocked a lot of people. It shouldn't have, I suppose. But the Washington Post said, as I said today, the black budget for military intelligence 3-4 years ago was $52 billion that year. And to me, that's an awful lot of money when you're not talking about hardware. You're talking about people. $52 billion. That's a lot. That's mostly NSA, CIA, and NRO. So there's a lot going on that your local reporter doesn't know about.
All right.
Well, I've got to disagree with one thing. We made a huge leap here when you talked about Olson being murdered. No indication of that. Now, he was involved in the LSD experiments, and it's highly controversial, but to make a claim of murder, I think, is a pretty big leap there. The other thing that happened, and I think what's germane to what we're talking about here, is from this came the Church Commission, and what you're talking about, Stan, is right, and the laws were changed to what you could and couldn't do. I know the DDO at the time, and they did kill, it took a lot of soul searching and going through and killing a lot of programs, just anything that they thought might denigrate the organization. And they became very, because Congress did get on their ass and make some pretty sweeping changes. But I think that's one of the things that argues against some of these deep programs that have lasted 50, 60 years without discovery.
Next question.
John, you can mea culpa this one if you want. For the rest of you, I'd like to know the following questions about Men in Black. 1, do you think they're real? 2, have you ever had an encounter? And 3, if so, who owns them?
All right, let's start with Charles.
The only thing I can say, I've never met the Men in Black. I've heard enough about them from other people. I do know people came to Bentwaters the day after the first night. I don't think anybody was wearing black. I actually was able to identify some of the people and go back to the witnesses, and they said, that's the guy that did it. Now, he was not wearing black. I never saw a black helicopter. I don't know anybody that wears black, but I can't comment anymore.
Did you find out who they work for?
No, I do know who they work for, and we'll talk about that tomorrow.
All right, great.
Nice move.
I'll repeat the story I told you when I bought your book. It's a very interesting book that's out, that I was one of the Men in Black. Pretty coincidentally, this had to do with the Gulf Breeze case. I had intended to go there. I had a briefing at Special Operations Command headquarters down in Tampa at a team that was, I was at Los Alamos at the time, the others were from the Skunk Works, and pushing a potential for a new project. So we were briefing at Special Operations Command was Tampa, MacDill, and the next day was going to be at Hurlburt Field with AFSOC. So we were going to stop near Tampa. Well, it turned out that we had the briefing late afternoon, fully dressed, got to the airport, storms rolled in, we couldn't fly. So by the time we arrived in Pensacola, it's already dark, but we're already still dressed up. And I planned to drop these other guys off and change clothes. But, and it just turned out that the rental car company gave us a big, very dark green sedan that sure looked like a black one. So, yeah, the four of us showed up, coats and ties, men in black.
Did you have sunglasses on?
Yeah.
Ted?
I've never had any experience with this sort of thing. I've heard about it, but I really don't have anything to contribute to this. I don't know anything about it.
I have never been approached by a men in black.
All right, there's your answer. Next
Sorry.
question. Thank you.
This is a little more mundane than Ray's question. Under state sunshine laws and under FOIA, if you don't get what you want and you think they have it, you file litigation. When you file the litigation, the custodian of records or the FOIA officer does a declaration under penalty of perjury that they've turned everything over. If they don't know about it or they're not read into it, what's the use of FOIA? And I think that's one of our problems. And so tell me I'm wrong, except for maybe radar cases or, mundane background documents. I see FOIA as sort of a waste of time.
I think, John, you
Yeah,
felt
I
the
would
same
say
way.
that's good luck.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is that the people who are working for you are admin people who have no knowledge of the technologies. They're doing like you would, a keyword search, finding documents that are in there. As I say, they're not the sharpest knives in the drawer.
Well, even
This
if
is
they
not
are.
a job that people aspire to, is to be a FOIA representative.
Well, even if they are, if they're not read into it or don't have access to it,
Well,
they can sign it.
no, that they wouldn't, but that would have been classified anyway and would have been automatically excluded. Some of them do have clearances, but then you have to go through, we have these lengthy processes for declassification, are abysmal, quite frankly. I mean, as I say, the overclassification issue cannot be overstated.
Charles, did you have a response?
I was a recipient of a FOIA investigation and a request for my memo that I wrote. The memo was typed in the office on a select typewriter. You know, the old typewriters with the little element or the ball, they called it. It was a carbon copy or carbon manifold. Somehow or other that went missing. I have no idea how. And then we got a FOIA request from Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett when they were working on Clear Intent. And we went back and said, we have no record. We told them there was an incident, but we have no record of it, and that was the truth. Several years later, when I wanted a copy of my memo, guess where I got it? Off the internet. These things, what I'm saying is every FOIA request that gets turned down and we say we don't have it, it can be legitimate. But you're right, there's a lot of things that don't go back.
Ted?
Well, and at the same time, you have a situation like Leslie Keene, who FOIA'd the records for the Kecksburg matter. And they were not forthcoming. She sued for them, won the lawsuit, and still didn't get her box of materials. So you could say they were lost or misplaced or whatever, but the connection was never made between the requester and the materials. So and that was probably the primary mission.
I would be taking someone's money if I filed a FOIA case, frankly. Thanks.
Let me mention one strange example in a sense. At the Eisenhower Library, I was going through materials and I ran across a withdrawal sheet. Something had been taken from the file because it was properly classified. So you can make a mandatory classification review request. And it's a straightforward procedure. You tell them what the page is and all that sort of stuff, and they submit the request. And the time to get a response to that, this is where you'd identify a document. You hadn't seen it, but there was mention that it existed. And the average response time was running over 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, and I was glad I'd made the request because what I got helped me a great deal in establishing that certain things were true. But the frustration, and when you hear that some people have waited 6 years, this is on a mandatory classification where you've identified the thing. Yeah. So it isn't easy. You'd think, well, they've got the document, but it goes at the bottom of this agency's pile, and they think that, well, it ought to be looked at by that agency, and it goes at the bottom of their pile. Mm-hmm. And you've died by the time it got to the end of the road.
Even the organization that got the term Area 51 declassified. It took them something like 9 years to respond to that, get that declassified. By then, there were video games called Area 51. There was, it was all over the place, T-shirts, hats. It was the most famous, but the most secret base, all at the same time. Next question.
Afternoon, gentlemen. Stan, you mentioned, you've all mentioned different things that pertain to what I'm going to posit. So Stan, you talked about if Hitler had the Nazi bell, why wouldn't he have deployed it? You also talked about what you show your friends, you also show your enemies. We've also talked a lot about FOIA, and we have also talked a lot about black budget. I want to tie these concepts together into, let's use our imagination here at the very least, and posit that there may be an organization, and also where does all the information from the letter agencies end up, okay? Imagine that there is an extra governmental, an extra military, an extra corporate organization, probably worldwide in scope, that is retaining these technologies, this information, this black budget money for their own use. They're compartmentalized within our own government, within our own military, and they're utilizing this technology for their own ends and ultimately creating a breakaway civilization.
Creating a, what did you say, breakaway civilization? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That's what I said, Stan.
Imaginative.
My question is, what would they be building if they're a Trump Tower? I mean, we don't see any major construction.
So
well, it's true though. We don't see. We
they're
don't
not
see
going
the
to build
results.
it here.
Okay. Okay. No, he answered the question. So, a breakaway civilization that's using this technology to build perhaps advanced bases or on other planets.
I think you heard the audience's response to what I had to say. Imagine Columbus coming out to the New World, discovering it, and then never telling Queen Isabella. Okay?
So let them, let's see what their
but he was a
response is.
latecomer.
Excuse me?
Columbus was a latecomer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, does anybody
so the point
have
is,
a
it had been discovered many times before.
Sure.
And hadn't held over. No, I had a question. I think it was kind of related because I didn't follow the logic of non-government getting government funding and all of that. But
Or you don't want to follow it, but go
the,
ahead.
Let him answer.
The thing on advanced comes up all the time is that there's some advanced energy technology. One of the things I've said about UFOs is a little widget flying around is inconsequential compared to understanding a fundamental different source of energy. Having said that, if you did, it is the game changer. It changes geopolitics completely. But, there's a big but, if I have that today, it will take you, we've looked at the numbers on it, it takes 2 to 3 decades in order to inculcate, well, stay with me here, where are you going to fill up you drove here, or how'd you get here?
Yeah, I drove my 97 5.9.
But you got a car, right? So
Yeah.
you went to a gas station.
Yeah.
And the gas station got gas, and the gas came from someplace, either from wherever it came from, it had to be refined, it had to do that. To do the infrastructure necessary to make that change takes 2 to 3 decades. Look at what's happening today with electric cars, for instance. We've had electric cars for decades. And we are just now beginning to get to the point where there are certain shopping centers may have a place where you can recharge and things like that. This is the embryonic stage of the
But I think, to your argument, that's using kind of the standard, governmental sort of procedures and regulations with, it's got to go through all of these processes and checks. He's talking about, and maybe Stan, you could speak to this, I'd love your thoughts. If we did, someone did back engineer the Roswell craft, but it was a private organization and they didn't share that information with the government. Do you think that's possible? And then they've used this for their own means, perhaps even to build bases elsewhere or to build housing and things like that.
There's a disconnect there someplace between something that for military implications where cost doesn't matter much, What's that new fighter cost, the F-35?
F-35.
F-35.
Yep, 30.
How many million or billion dollars per? The civilian world doesn't work in those terms, frankly. Only the military can afford that kind of stuff, is my view.
Ted, do you have some thoughts on that? Let's let Ted answer, actually.
I'm not big on conspiracy theories. Our work is pretty nuts and bolts, but there's something to be said here in that the physics around how these things work is not so arcane. There are physicists that are working on them who think they understand a little bit about how these things fly, the principles behind them. And the information, for example, Robert Bigelow went into aerospace, and he immediately, he'd been going after UFO information anyway, but he really went after it at that point, started buying up everybody's researcher files and everything else. What was the purpose of that? The purpose is that he's building an aerospace company. If he can reduce the boost per, the dollar cost to boost per pound into orbit, then he dominates the market. And he's actively going after it. And I don't think it's terribly imaginative to think that there's some very bright people who may have gone up that road already with a completely different agenda. And we do have stories of occupants that are more human-like and that kind of stuff. So I offer that just as consideration. It's speculative. I don't have evidence like this, but it doesn't seem necessarily that remarkable to me.
I think we should move to the next question, because obviously this group is not open to that. But I know this is something that Richard Dolan does talk about quite a bit. So I think he would be the most appropriate person to talk to more about that further. But yeah, let's.
Has any groups really looked at, say, the government UFO disinformation in the last 2 decades, what they have done through documents? And the second question is, has the government in the last 2 decades used, say, cults and groups that are off the table to discredit legitimate UFO researchers?
Have they tried to discredit religion with UFOs?
No, not religion. Discredit UFO researchers by using some cults and some fringe UFO groups.
Oh, to discredit. So, for instance, perhaps have the aliens, for example, who say they've gotten information from aliens, but they also do their topless campaigns.
Yeah.
Is something like that perhaps used to discredit UFOs overall? Do you guys have any thoughts on that? Not really. So, sorry. Next question.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. What I wanted to talk about is the national security oaths that we had to take. I'm a former NASA employee, and upon leaving, we had to sign oaths that we would not declare anything classified. And my question to you, Colonel, is did that have an effect on your decision to come forward? And one other thing, I just wanted to tell you that I believe that you're a U.S. Hero.
Thank you. Well,
And I believe a lot of other people feel that way.
Well, I'll answer both questions. First of all, my last job, I told you what I did. I was the inspection director for the ZODIG. I was approached in 1991 by Unsolved Mysteries to do a program, which I did do. But before I did it, I went and talked to my boss, the DODIG. And I said, I've been approached by Unsolved Mysteries, Robert Stack and that whole gang, and they want me to do a program. He said, sit down and tell me about it. So 2 hours later, he said, go do it. I did. And no repercussions immediately from the military, anyhow. My contemporaries never mind, we won't go into that. But the interesting thing is, when I left the military and retired, I did something like probably happened to you. I was very thoroughly debriefed because of the classifications. I had access to all the different materials and inspections and so forth. And we went through everything step by step by step by step to make sure I clearly understood, which I did. And I was asked to sign the documents, and I said, but what about Bentwaters? And they said, Bentwaters? I said, yes. They said, what was Bentwaters? I said, well, we had an incident with a supposed UFO, and I was involved in this, that, and the next thing. And they said, don't worry about it. So here we are, which tells you one thing. The government doesn't always work together, and those guys had no idea what some other agencies may have been doing.
Right. I was just wondering if, there's a bubble of national security like the NSC, NSA. I would imagine took a
Well, I'm one of
big
the few
interest in
outsiders
you.
that actually got into NSA, if you know what I mean.
Right.
But I didn't learn many secrets there, to be honest with you.
No, that was my question. I was just wondering if that had an effect on your decision to come forth and discuss the
Well, I
UFO
didn't
industry.
voluntarily come forth. You have to understand that.
Yes, sir.
I did everything I could to keep my memo from being released, and I'll talk about that tomorrow. I didn't want my tape released, because it is not career enhancing in the military. That's one reason the air traffic controllers that actually saw the objects on scope, visually saw them that night, never came forward, because they knew every other air traffic controller that came forward got decertified. And they didn't want to become a butcher or a cook or a baker or, or a mechanic or whatever. So, to answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Next question. We have time for a couple more.
This question is for the whole panel and our MC too. I've noticed that our demographic here, and John, you alluded to this, skews a little bit older. As a representative of the younger generation, what are the biggest challenges you guys face in communicating with younger people, and how can I help?
That's a great question.
I had a whole comedy act on this during my talk, actually, but I've got it all broken down.
Let me give you some good news then. I mentioned it in my talk, and that is, Tom DeLonge is coming along, and he is specifically targeting millennials. And he's got movies, TV programs, and whatnot. And yeah, that's a problem because, we dinosaurs are, it's going to be a dying breed. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, I would say, just to synthesize what I had said before, we do a lot of social media, and, it seems younger people like to interact more. Mm-hmm. They don't like to be just kind of told what's going on, and they don't like to necessarily sit in a room and hear a lecture. It seems that it's been my experience. We've had organizations and universities and such. And so we do have a lot more online interaction, especially if the story's shorter, like 144 characters, like Twitter. But it just seems to be that that's just a different way of communicating and interacting. And I feel it is something that we need to do. And unfortunately, I've often brought ideas to UFO organizations, most of who are run by people in their 60s and 70s, and they don't seem to often want to change the way they do things. Not that they understand necessarily this new world of fast and quick communication, but I think, it's incumbent upon us, if we truly want to reach out, then to try to learn how to communicate in that manner.
Let me add one little thing. Mm-hmm. I've got a son that's just a little younger than you. I subscribe to many magazines, Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, and different technical magazines, and the newspaper. He doesn't read a single one of them. He's like this all the time, but he's extremely well informed. You can bring up almost any subject you want, and he knows all about it. Because, he just, whether it's politics, science, religion, anything, he's very well versed. Will not read anything in hard print. You're right.
One other thing I would add, though, and this word career enhancing has come up. What we mean by that is this is not a good way to advance whatever career you're in because of certain stigmas attached. I frequently get emails from people say, how can I get a job doing this? One of my things was, you better have a day job if you're going to get in here. Because if you're starting looking for how are you going to advance and be able to make money at it, it's tough.
Yeah, assuming I have a day job, what would be the best thing that me or someone like me could do to continue to transmute this knowledge that seems to be concentrated?
Retweet would be my answer, but yeah, let's go to Ted.
You asked specifically how you can help.
Correct.
All right. There's a whole next generation of researchers coming on board. They're very good working with archives and researching digital information. There's also new technology coming online where those of you who want to go out and bring your cameras and your night vision and collect data and then learn how to write a paper and present it and then bring it around to those of us who care about it, it's possible. I'm establishing an organization called the International Association of UAP Researchers, and its whole purpose is to pull a college of experts together to help people with research and help them with publication and then present a peer-reviewed journal to allow that to happen. And we very much welcome the youth energy in that. I'm 56 now. I started into this when I was 40. 39, somewhere in there. And as John says, keep your day job. But we've been doing research out on sites where UAP manifest repeatedly. Dr. Strand is aware of this, or Mr. Strand's aware of this. Dr. Teodorani has run a program, UFO Data, with Leslie Keene and Mark Rodiger and Jose Lay. And I'm working a bit with all of those, boosting them and trying to encourage people to go out and do some of this work. Learn how to take spectral photographs using diffraction grading. That's probably one of the most useful things that general researchers out there could do right now, is get some diffraction grading when they're trying to shoot UAP, calibrate it against the nearest street light, either immediately before or immediately after, and then get us some spectra data on what you're seeing. Spectral photographs, and we're happy to coach you on all of that. And if you want to get further involved, contact me, Ted Rowe. I'm NARCAP, right through the website, or
Excellent.
or catch me right after this thing. We want your energy. We want what you have to bring. Okay, you're the next step.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate what you guys are all doing.
Sure.
One last question.
It's a quick one.
Thank you very much. We'll be in touch.
And this has been an amazing panel, and you've done a fabulous job, Alejandro.
Thank you. Speak
up. This question is for John. You made a quick comment about helicopters and how you had trouble when you were investigating the Cash Landrum case in trying to verify that there had actually been helicopters there. And then you made a quick comment about how you didn't know about this helicopter group. I'm very interested in mysterious helicopters. This is something that comes up a lot in Montana. If you could, and I haven't heard about this other helicopter group that you didn't know about, and could you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
One of the disadvantages of being behind the speaker.
Oh, yeah. So she's asking about... So she's asking about, and I know John has a very interesting answer, when it came to the helicopters, what is your theory behind what those helicopters were if they weren't real military helicopters?
Yeah, highly theoretical, and it's one of two possibilities. One is they could project them, like holograms that were, had hard, could be seen in that. The other is that it could put that directly into the minds of the observers.
Didn't you say that, though, there was a helicopter group that you did not know about at the time? Did I not hear that?
Okay. You're talking, what I mentioned was Task Force 160.
Say again?
There was a Task Force 160 with a black helicopter unit, SME, that at the time was unknown. But what we do know is we had checked every helicopter. The only military helicopter that had been in the area that day had landed back at Fort Hood by 5 o'clock that afternoon. George went so far as to look at the oil industry. The Marines, the closest Marines were off of Florida. They had a floating unit off of Florida. It was definitely not them. So the question was, could this have been the oil rig, the helicopters that take folks to oil rigs? It wasn't them.
Well, what is Task Force 160?
I'm sorry?
What is Task Force 160?
It was on stand down at Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
So it was one possible answer, but he eventually ruled it out. But what he's saying, which is a good thing to end on, is that his theory is that this non-human sentient intelligence somehow projected possibly these helicopters into their mind and or was able to create a holographic image of helicopters in association with this UAP.
As crazy as that is, it comes up as the most prosaic answer.
Yeah.
But you ruled out this Task Force 160?
No, like I say, and George Saran is the guy who did a great job of running down every helicopter, like I say, military or not, that feasibly could have been involved. And again, part of the problem is what Chuck noted is we're talking between Christmas and New Year's. And particularly in those years, those are non-war years, if you will. You go to a 50-50 Stan, I mean, you do not do major operations during that period. I mean, everybody's physically gone.
I get it.
We were actually having a Christmas party when I got involved.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. Thank you to this great panel.